Hey there. I'm Fiona, and I'm a software engineer on Etsy's search experience team. And I'm going to talk about search ranking today. So when we generally talk about search ranking, we always talk about optimizing to meet the needs of the searcher in terms of like precision and recall and things like that. But I think we often forget about the ways in which we're also serving the searchee. And by searchee, I mean the people who create the data that we're searching across. So my talk today is about approaches to ranking to create a fair system to incentivize like good citizenship when your data providers are like aware of the algorithm that you have and respond to it in competitive ways. So I'm going to talk about some techniques that have worked at Etsy, but I think a lot of the learnings generalize to any competitive search environment. And the talk, it's a bit of like a philosophical talk, but about how ranking fits into our company values. So I'm going to stay somewhat high level and try to cover a lot, but I'll go into detail where I think it makes sense. So first off, what is Etsy? For people who aren't familiar with Etsy, it's an online marketplace for selling handmade, vintage, and craft supplies. And it's peer-to-peer, so our users are both our buyers and our sellers. So we don't control any inventory, and that also means that we don't really control our content. Etsy's also a community, so lots of our buyers are sellers. There's a huge intersection between those two groups. So by no means are those like mutually exclusive groups of people. And we're based in Brooklyn, New York. So this is a picture from our office in Dumbo, where I work. And that big structure was actually the first Etsy bike rack in our original office. So to give a sense for our scale, these numbers are as of June 2015. We have 1.5 million active sellers and almost 22 million active buyers. And collectively, those sellers have listed over 30 million items for sale on the site. And so we call items on the site listings, and I'll probably keep using that term throughout this talk. So there's actually several types of search on Etsy. So users can search for shops. They can search through private messages that they've sent each other, or through public forum posts in our public forums. They can even search for like local craft fairs in their area. But I'm going to focus on listing search because that's really our bread and butter, and it's where the stakes of our ranking choices are by far the highest. So hopefully you made it out to Greg Donovan's talk yesterday, where he talked about how we shard our search. We use Solr, of course, for listing search. And that went into much more detail about our infrastructure. So today I'm going to focus on ranking. So what happens, what does listing search look like? What happens when I go to Etsy and I type in banana leaf print cushion cover? I see something like this. So what do our users want from this page? What do our users want from listing search? They want really simple things on the surface. So our buyers want to see, of course, the most relevant items, the highest quality, most relevant items. And our sellers want a buyer to see their items. They want to get seen in search. So a query like this one, like banana leaf print cushion cover, is kind of an easy slam dunk for search. So we have 4 of these. They all show up, and they would probably do so with out-of-the-box Solr. And seller and buyer alike are probably pretty happy because a buyer's found what they're looking for, and a seller has gotten their item in front of a buyer. But our marketplace is not uniformly distributed. We have a lot of inventory in certain categories like jewelry and art and accessories. And not all queries are quite this specific. So many really common queries, many common broad queries like necklace, actually return millions of items. I think it's tough to see, but this search returns over 3 million items. And that's a lot. A buyer might be happy with the selection in this query. Certainly there's a lot of high quality necklaces here. But a seller, by the definition of satisfaction from before, is probably not going to be happy with this search result because only a handful of sellers are represented on this page out of all the sellers that we have, the 1.5 million that we have on Etsy. And competition is inevitable. It's not a bad thing. It certainly serves our buyers really well. But the stakes are really high for sellers, and it's really meaningful to them to get seen. So Etsy has teams, what we call teams, which are like groups where users kind of self-organize to discuss either business topics or just hang out and chit-chat. And we have many SEO teams, but our largest one actually has over 15,000 members. And they share like tips and expertise with each other, and they're fairly active. And there's also almost 500 listings specifically for SEO guides or personal sessions with Etsy SEO experts listed on the site. And I bring this up, just to say our sellers are really serious. They're running real businesses, and they put in the work, to get seen in search. So the stakes are really high for them, and we have an obligation to optimize, to do right by them. So of course, trivially, the optimal solution for everybody is just to return the best listings. And this is an obvious goal, but not something that's really specific enough to guide a ranking algorithm. So let's deep dive on best. What we want is to create a system that values informative and readable data, that's accurate and honest, and has some notion of like the quality or authority of the document. So that's a better definition. But we also really need to think about the result set holistically and over time. So we want to make sure that the results express the breadth of our marketplace and that they're dynamic enough to feel fresh and provide what exposure we can to like a large range of sellers. So this is a better definition of the objective of our ranking system. We want to return a diverse, fresh mix of the most informative, honest, and high-quality listings. And this is a mural near my desk in Brooklyn, and it says, it's kind of tough to read, but it says, "Buy good things from real people." And I think this is an even better like summary of what we're trying to do with search. You know, it reminds me that effective search serves both interests well. That it helps you as a searcher discover great items, but it also is connecting you with someone real who creates those items and is impacted by being discovered. And so this is really the distillation of what we're trying to do, to balance both sides and treat both parties fairly. And it really doesn't have to feel like a conflict of interest at all when we use thoughtful best practices. Etsy also has 5 core values, and don't worry too much about reading these because they'll come back up, because I think they're really reflected in the way that we approach search ranking. So I've broken out this talk with each section corresponding to one of these core values. Cool. And so I'll begin with our first one, which is we keep it real always. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is the basic gameability of search ranking, meaning basically how easy is it to get a high score by being, if not dishonest, somewhat disingenuous in the way that the user provides information. And this corresponds to keeping it real because we want our marketplace to benefit sellers who are authentic and genuine in the information that they provide. So this is a fanzine that I made in high school when I was 18, and I've decided to list it on Etsy. It has a lot of sentimental value to me, so I haven't really priced it to sell quick. I put it up for $100. But, but I do want it to get seen, so I'm going to try to optimize it for search. So for some background on how Lucene does document scoring, the out-of-the-box calculation of the score for a document for a given query is essentially the sum of the tf-idf values of the terms in the query of the document. And so for those who might not be familiar, tf-idf is a measure of how often the term appears in the document given how rare it is in the entire document set. So the idea is the rarer a term is, the more important we deem it to be in determining the relevance of the document to the query. And at Etsy, for some perspective, the term jewelry, which is really common to see in our listings, has an IDF of 1.2, and the term pepperoni has an IDF of 4.4. So if you were to search for pepperoni jewelry, which, by the way, has 500 matches on Etsy right now, so check that out later. So then pepperoni would be a more important component of the match on the title and tags. So this is my listing, and zooming in on my title, in this context, the TF, the term frequency, of zine is 2, because it shows up twice in this title. And the IDF of zine happens to be on the order of 3.3, because it's somewhere between jewelry and pepperoni in terms of how often it shows up on our site. So with out-of-the-box similarity scoring, this is the best possible listing that I could possibly create. Because before I said zine 2 times, and now I'm saying it 20 times, so it's 10 times more relevant to the query zine. So this is somewhat honest. It is a zine, but it's not informative, and it's definitely not readable, and it's not the kind of title that we want our buyers to be seeing on the site. So the solution to this is super simple. We just set TF to 1 when the term is present in the document, and to 0 when it's not. So this is the same tf-idf formula from before, but with TF just dropped from the equation. And so by not double counting terms, we completely remove the incentive to spam through repetition. And it's very simple. And it's very simple to override the TF method and the default tf-idf similarity class in Solr, and accomplish this with minimal fuss. So this is not a complicated technical solution. It's a few lines of code. Cool. So setting TF to 1 works pretty well in the context of a listing title because it's relatively short and there wouldn't be that much repetition in it naturally to begin with. But in the context of a longer field, you probably don't want to drop that signal on the floor. TF is like 101. The more times somebody says something, the more likely it is that they're talking about it. So you could imagine doing something less aggressive in a longer field context, like doing log of TF rather than just setting it to 1 or 0. And that would allow for like some notion of the term being more important without letting it dominate the score. And in fact, the full story about listings is that they contain this 20-word title and also a very long description, in which context setting TF to 1 probably wouldn't make as much sense. It turns out to be a non-issue for us because we don't actually index the longer description at all. when we index the fields. We don't want users SEO optimizing in that space because we want them to feel like free to just natural language, human-oriented, say what they want to say about the listing. And so by not indexing that field, then we also remove the incentive to SEO optimize in that context and have kind of robotic keyword stuffing kind of behavior there. So instead of the description, we have a tags field where we allow sellers to kind of keyword stuff to their heart's content. So these are the tags for my listing. And of course, we also do set TF to 1 in that context, or else, again, we would see repetition there. So these are the tags for my listing. And those first 4 tags with the capital letters, those are actually not tags that I explicitly put in the listing process. Those are the names of the taxonomy nodes that I placed my listing in when I listed it. When sellers list something, they say, what kind of item is this? And they place it in our taxonomy. And so this is kind of like the flip side of indexing the right fields. By not indexing description, we remove the incentive to SEO optimize there. But by indexing some structured data, we add an incentive for sellers to be honest and provide this information that we really want them to provide. And so don't index what you don't want to optimize, but do index whatever structured data you want people to be providing. Cool. So those are the 2 takeaways there. Cool. So now there's a relatively low incentive to create spammy titles and create spammy descriptions. But if we're not paying attention to term frequency, then how could we possibly separate one listing with zine in the title and tags from the next listing with zine in the title and tags, of which there are plenty? So we need some notion of quality and authority. And we value craftsmanship in all that we make, and our quality signal is how we reward great craftsmanship in our sellers. So again, this is the first fanzine that I made. And this is the second issue that I made. And I got a lot better at making cool fonts. And I realized that crayons don't photocopy that well, so I kind of cleaned up the design a little bit. So I've listed this much higher quality item, objectively a much better thing. I priced it at $200 to reflect this. Cool. So this is how they might show up in search. And our quality signal is based on information about how our users interact with items. So clicks is one of those signals. So when I click on this from search, our event logger, so it gets posted to what we call our event pipe, which takes that event data and ships it to Hadoop. And once we have that data on HDFS, we can write MapReduce jobs to aggregate behavioral information about the listing in the aggregate and sort of learn what's the probability of an engagement on this listing. So when a listing outperforms our expectations, then we increase its score. Pretty simple. The really important thing that we have to watch out for here is presentation bias. So on this page, this is how these listings might show up in search. And issue number 1 is somewhat more likely to be clicked just by virtue of being higher up on the page, by virtue of being the first listing that shows up. And we don't want to think that it's a better listing just because we happen to show it higher up on the page. We don't want a feedback loop where things lower on the page get lower on the page and lower on the page, et cetera. So what we do is we actually introduce a small amount of randomness, not even on the Solar side, but on the web side, in the order that we show these listings, so that we can compare listings in the same slot to each other. And so over time, given that they were in the same spot, which one saw more engagement, which one saw that behavior more, and watch which one wins, and that's how we calculate that quality score. So we calculate these scores nightly. We output just a key value pair, listing ID as an int, to quality score as a float. And then we ship that to search as an EFF. So that's an external file field, which is a way of storing arbitrary data outside of the index. And they were talking about it a little bit in Stump the Chump last night. So this is what an EFF-based field declaration looks like. This is in schema.xml. And these fields are kind of interesting. They're not searchable and they can't be sorted on, but they can be used in function queries. And that's what our quality score is a multiplicative boost implemented as function query. So the big advantage of the EFF approach is, we can write to these all the time. We can swap them out and modify them ad hoc without re-indexing. If we change every listing quality score overnight, we don't need to worry about writing that many times to the index. And also, it makes it really easy to switch between them for experiments because they're not in the index or they're not growing the size of the index. And we can just swap between them at will. So Etsy's problem with using behavioral signals for quality is that we have so many one-of-a-kind items. So it's handmade, vintage, and craft supplies. So most vintage items are listed only once and never again after they sell, and many handmade items as well. And so we can watch clicks until something sells, but it doesn't give us much of a runway to learn about the quality of the item. And so what we do is we bootstrap the signal on the seller level. So we start a listing begins with an average sort of that seller's listing quality scores, which allows us to take like a good initial guess on the quality and bootstrap from there. And this is really helpful across the board, not just for vintage and one of a kind, because it gives us a good starting place. So this is fairly trivial, but to keep our score up to date, this is like the new world order for the formula to calculate the score for a document. So that quality score is a multiplicative boost on the base topicality or relevance score. Cool. So I'm going to talk about how do we keep the result set from monolithically favoring certain sellers who happen to do the best on SEO and quality, especially because we're bootstrapping those quality scores on the seller level. How do we keep it from just having a few winners in the system? And this value to section pairing might be a bit of a stretch, but the way I think about it, having boring and samey results would not be fun, and we believe fun should be part of everything that we do, so we kind of want to mix things up a little bit. So let's imagine that my listings are a huge hit, as they should be, and they consistently outperform other listings on click rate and engagements. So then all I need to do is either finish the series or just duplicate them a few times, and I can stage like a full takeover of this query and always win. And this is awesome for me as a seller, but it's not ideal for any other seller because nobody else is showing up on the page. And it's really not ideal for a buyer, even if my listings are very good, because they're not getting a sense of like the full breadth of what's available and the full range of things that match what they're looking for. So we diversify the results set by seller. And I'm not going to get too much into the details of this because it's a really sensitive topic. You know, we're re-ranking things and moving people around on the page. But I'll talk a little bit about the mechanism. So don't worry too much about reading this. I'll zoom in on the relevant part in a minute. But basically, so we shard seller by process, as Greg talked about yesterday. So this diversification step has to happen after we've already received results from all the sub-processes, the shards, and combine them into a total result set. And we call that our mixer layer, the step that combines everything together into one unified result set. So the Diversifier is a custom step in our mixer layer that integrates groups of results broken out by seller ID. And this is kind of like a simplified version of the code that we use to progressively reshuffle results until we reach the desired level of diversity. So here's the interesting component of that code. We have this low-level interface to integrate groups of results. And what we're doing is just like iteratively applying that to increasingly large portions of the result set until we can get enough candidates to achieve that level of diversity that we're looking for. So adding diversity gives us a broader range of results to choose from. Unfortunately, I don't rule the roost anymore, but this is clearly a better result set for the query zine. So that's a big improvement. But we also want items to be fresh across time. So courtesy of Wayback Machine, this is what Etsy search looked like in 2011. And back when the site looked like this, up until summer 2011, Etsy listing search was actually sorted by recency by default. So the most recent items were always at the top. It's still a sort option, but now, of course, we sort by relevancy. And we wouldn't want to go back to sorting by recency. But moderately boosting recently created items really helps the search results feel fresh over time. And it helps provide what exposure we can to like a lot of sellers. And it helps us bootstrap that quality signal because we need to get listings in front of people in order to learn about their quality and about the engagement rate with those listings. So a moderate recency boost helps us with all of these things. And all we do is store listing creation date on the index and boost the most recently created items. So that recency score is just the inverse of the time elapsed between now and the time of listing creation. And we can keep it, you know, in a defined range, like between 1 and 1, or between 0 and 0.1 by calculating it, something like this. And of course, I'll feed it back into our score. So now our full scoring function before the diversity re-ranking and before the re-ranking for the quality comparisons looks like this. So we've got multiplicative boost on quality from an EFF and recency from an index field. We're adding 1 to the recency value, so ultimately, you know, we're multiplying the base score by something like between 1 and 1.1 or something like that to have it comprise a reliable portion of the score. Cool. So this is one of my favorite Etsy values that we as a business plan and build for the long term. And we really want our sellers to be able to do that too. Freshness in the sense of like shop diversity and recency is kind of a known constant that sellers can plan around, that they understand. But more fundamental ranking changes can really affect their ability to plan for their business. If traffic swings up one day and down the next day just because of changes that we're making in search, they can't really plan for the long term. And I also love this icon because the section is really about tooling. and the tooling that we use to avoid creating ranking churn. So there's two main tools that we use to measure ranking churn at Etsy, and the first one is called the Rhee Player. That's built by my coworker Zita, who is here. And so it's a fairly complex tool, which really could justify another full talk in its own right. So I'll just briefly summarize what it does. So it's a command line tool. It has a command line interface, and it uses sampled request logs to replay real sampled traffic against hosts in real time. And when I say request logs, I mean Thrift request logs, because we use Thrift to communicate between our web stack, which is PHP, and Solr. And so this command line interface, it accepts hosts at the bottom there. The variant host control is one, test is the other. It accepts a duration and a queries per second rating. And it also, that class name is that fourth bullet there is a way of programmatically filtering or altering requests, so that if you're testing a specific type of change, you can either filter to or create the types of requests that you're interested in testing. And what you get from the Rhee Player is realistic statistics on average and worst case impact of your change. So this is a screen cap of some of the output that we might get from this Rhee Player and the rank shift information. And so this is a three-way comparison. So you see A versus B, A versus C, and then what I'm seeing is item level shift distribution tells me what fraction of items have moved between 0 and 1 places in search, and between 420 and infinity places in search. And then it also gives me information on the request level about, in the P95, what fraction of requests saw an item move by this much. So it gives me a good sense of both how many requests are impacted and how many items are impacted by this change. The second tool that we use to evaluate ranking churn is called Rank Delta, and that's a web UI. And it allows users, rather than sampling real traffic, it allows you to specify whatever query set you want, and also what thrift parameters you want to set on the request, so creating custom requests. And it also allows you to specify the host that you want to search against. And what it does is it provides very high-level statistics about the results, like how many of these queries were impacted in any way. But it also gives you kind of a deep dive on how things changed. So I can see the full query set sort of in the same format that they would appear on the site. And that really helps me build an intuition for what the change was that I made. So in an ideal world, we'd love to integrate these tools, because they evolved really not because we needed two separate tools, but because separate teams, the search infrastructure team that Z works on and the search experience team that I work on, had similar but not identical needs, for testing and offline analysis. But I often end up using both in the course of making a change, and they play pretty well together. So that Rank Delta tool, as I said, it helps me build an intuition for what's changed between one version of the change and the next. And the Rhee Player gives much stronger guarantees about how much an item has shifted and how much we can expect to impact different requests and different sellers. We still need to make trade-offs in order to make changes, but we can do so with an understanding of the impact on individual sellers and on requests at large. Cool. So the last thing I want to talk about is just communicating about ranking. So all these changes that we make and the system of incentives that we build out, it's not really worthwhile if users don't understand it, and if users don't understand how to optimize for search effectively and honestly. So we try to be transparent and to short-circuit behavior in the ranking algorithm rather than through secrecy. But at the same time, we need to be able to experiment in a controlled environment. So we need to have a little wiggle room in the ranking so that we can change it and make it better. And we have the way that we communicate with sellers is mostly through this seller handbook that was created by our comms team at Etsy. And props to them for all the hard work they do communicating this stuff to people in a really accessible way. We actually have 24 separate articles about SEO and getting found on Etsy, ranging from the basics, like what fields are we indexing, to more complicated issues like co-optimizing for Etsy search and Google search, which is a huge challenge for our sellers. And that's a lot of articles, but it's really not overkill at all when you remember that there are thousands, tens of thousands of users in a team dedicated to discussing SEO topics, and hundreds selling SEO guides that they made themselves. And the one constant that I really notice across all the communications that the comm team creates is that they focus on attributes of the system that are unlikely to change. because we don't want to have sellers keep checking in on our documentation and re-optimizing their listings and feeling like a large amount of their energy has to go toward changing what they're doing to suit search. And so sellers do have really contextual needs, and things do change over time. But rather than communicating that like super rigorously, what we do instead is provide like a feedback loop. So we have this tool called Shop Stats, where a seller can see how many times was this listing viewed versus that listing viewed, and favorited and purchased and things like that. But we also include like keyword attribution information. So this tells me what were the keywords from Etsy search and Google search that led users to viewing my listing. So I didn't get a ton of traction with my zines. I only got 6 views. But I can see that music zine and guitar zine are my top queries. So maybe I try to optimize for those. Or maybe I notice that I'm lagging a little bit on branded queries like Girls Guitar and Girls Guitar Club. Maybe I optimize for those. But in any case, I have a feedback loop that I can use to design a strategy for my shop. So this was a fairly Etsy-centric talk, but here are some key takeaways that I hope kind of generalize to other contexts, especially other contexts where your data providers are kind of competitive. So first off, basic little tweaks, really simple tweaks to the scoring algorithm can really nip spam in the bud. Secondly, quality signals should be taken really contextually based on the presentation of your listing results, but also, if you can, on the author of those results, because that's something that worked really well for us. Diversity in search is a heavy hitter because it serves the searcher's desire for breadth and the searchee's desire for exposure. Having quick offline tools for gauging the impact of a change is really invaluable and meaningful in the long term. And finally, when communicating with users, you want to express what you can safely expect to stay the same to avoid having users optimizing for outdated algorithms or, on the converse, constantly updating their documents. But I think really the key takeaway is going back to this idea that effective search consciously serves both types of users, and it gravitates toward the alignment of their interests rather than where they conflict. So thank you so much for your time. Thanks for listening. My info's up here, and I do want to plug Codiscraft, which is Etsy's engineering blog. We've done a few like search-related posts recently that are worth checking out. And also, we're hiring, so either check out etsy.com/careers or find one of the Etsy crew kind of in the first couple rows here to chat. It would be better. So thank you so much, and I guess I'll take questions. Hi.
So we become about the webbing is very search dependent, and we come to get to the point where in order to get the thing that we found, we search for it, and click on the link that's happening. Have you ever run into this problem where someone wants to come and find your Girls Guitar Club, and they knew it by the search string and the position of the page, but with the randomness, it's disappeared or rolled off. Is that become a problem, and if so, how do you solve it?
The randomness would never move listing off of the page. So the randomness for the quality signal would only swap things one place, actually, is how far it swaps them. The randomness with diversity would never take something that was the highest quality listing and highest ranking listing and move it off the first page. So the way that we calculate that, it's tough to get too much into it, but it would never move the best or the closest match off of the first page. So yeah, that's something we just had to hedge our bets on. And a small amount of randomness is sufficient for the type of like presentation bias avoidance that we were doing.
How do you deal with, like, in terms of diversity, one seller spamming an entire page?
Mm-hmm.
If they're all like really relevant, but you want the diversity, you get off one seller?
It's not like a quota system. It's not like one seller per page. We want it to be more sophisticated because, in fact, sometimes there is only one seller with really relevant items to a query. And it's hard to get into just because to talk really specifically about that, it's really sensitive among our sellers. You know, as you can imagine, being moved off the first page is something that's really like stressful. But so we have like a more kind of progressive definition of it that would make sure no seller would dominate the first page, but also that we're not doing like a super tight quota that would disadvantage someone who has a legitimate right to be on the first page. Okay.
Do you have anything, like, let's say you have some sellers that you think are really gaming the system and what they're doing is sort of making the search page look bad? Do you ever like sort of have a system sort of punching those sellers or demolling them or doing, or sort of just delisting them because they're just, you think they're just trying to see the system?
Not at all. You know, right now, we just don't have a big problem with SEO spam being something that causes bad listings on the first page. So we don't really have a system for that. We do have a system for removing sellers from search when they are doing something illegal or when they are like violating our terms and policies, but we haven't found that like SEO spam has been a reason to remove people.
One quick follow-up then. So let's say someone posts like bad objectionable material, such as like racist material or something like that. Do you automatically detect for that and flag it, or do you guys?
Yeah, we have some automatic detection of like extremely high risk things, but everything goes through like a human layer. We have a lot of people at Etsy who work hard to like make sure that nothing illegal or against our policies shows up in the marketplace. So there's no, we never automatically remove someone from search, to my knowledge. Oh, sorry, hey. Mm-hmm. That's a great question. That's something we've been experimenting with what we call query-specific re-ranking, which would say we want to accept these scores like on the level of a specific query. And we've also thought about breaking them out by other things in the past, like region. It's not something that we've done yet. You know, you're always competing with like, you want to have the highest signal available. You want to have the most impressions, you know, to feed into the signal. So it's not something that like is working for us right now, but it's something we're like consistently iterating on because, yeah, in fact, of course, a listing that might be highly relevant to one query and show up again for another query might not, in fact, be the best. Although when it comes to quality, it tends to be, our quality signal tends to be just a proxy for like image quality. So, yeah. Yeah, I think for the vast majority of searches on Etsy, so we have like very few like navigational searches where somebody's looking for like one specific thing or only one or two things on the page will do. It tends to be that the majority of our like ranking problems tend to be queries like necklace, where we certainly have plenty of necklaces. Everything is topical. Everything is relevant in like a basic way. And getting that quality signal on which are the most attractive and, you know, which is the user most likely to buy. So I think just optimizing for like an application-specific context in which that's like our major ranking challenge is led us to this being a pretty workable solution. It happens nightly. So we have a nightly job, scheduled MapReduce job that runs and outputs the data and ships it to the search boxes. Oh, it's query independent right now, but we'd like it to be query specific in the long run. Yeah. Phrase match is a really important, I didn't really touch on this, but phrase match is a really important component of the match. So actually going back to, this will take a second. Going back to the listing that I listed, I kind of SEO optimized this title for myself to see how well I could do, just for fun. But I did put the word zine in that title twice, and I left it in there twice because matching on phrase is like a huge thing. So this title allows me to match both on zine and music zine, which is something you could imagine somebody searching for. So yeah, but even when it comes to something like gold necklace, I assume we have, you know, hundreds of thousands of items that match that. So these problems extend way down to the long tail to differentiate multiplicative scores and the diversity, yeah. Cool. Well, there's no problem with having a little extra time to grab coffee and talk. So thank you so much.